How the American Civil War happened. Road to the war. Deep-seated divides within the United States, mainly over issues of slavery, states' rights, and economic disparities, gave rise to the historic American Civil War. The Confederacy was formed, and a war that would forever change the country began as a result of the Southern states' decision to secede after Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. In this video, we will highlight the key events and factors that contributed to the war, providing insight into how a series of political, social, and economic tensions culminated in one of the most defining conflicts in American history. Number 7. Election of Abraham Lincoln. The United States was becoming increasingly divided, and the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 was a turning point that symbolized this. As a candidate, Lincoln, a member of the recently established Republican Party, stood out for opposing the spread of slavery into new areas. This stance struck a chord with Northern voters who were becoming more and more swayed by abolitionist feelings and moral reasons against slavery. His campaign focused on maintaining the Union and modernizing the economy, appealing to a public that was starting to view slavery as both a moral evil and a barrier to advancement. There was a great deal of regional divisiveness during the election. In most southern states, Lincoln was not on the ballot, a sign of their growing disengagement from national politics. With fewer than 40% of the popular vote, he won, highlighting the fragmented political landscape and the South's growing sense of marginalization. Many Southern elites felt that they could no longer stay in a union led by a president who did not share their principles because they saw Lincoln's victory as an existential danger to their social order and economic interests. Leaders in the South began talking about secession as a result of this impression, which created the conditions for a violent conflict. Number 6. Secession of Southern States. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to leave the Union in direct reaction to Lincoln's election. This act was a declaration of independence based on the idea of state sovereignty and rights, not just a cynical political ploy. The leaders of South Carolina contended that they were acting in accordance with their constitutional right to leave a union that, in their opinion, no longer served to advance their interests or safeguard their way of life. By February 1861, 6 additional states had swiftly followed South Carolina's example: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Every state released proclamations defending their decision to secede, frequently stressing the threat that Lincoln's administration and Northern hostility against Southern institutions constituted. The American revolutionary ideas of liberty and independence permeated the discourse surrounding secession. Many Southerners saw themselves as protectors of their rights against what they saw as Northern oppression. Deep-seated concerns about losing economic and political control over slavery, an institution they saw as necessary for their agrarian economy and social hierarchy, were expressed in this group's collective action. They had a strong desire to preserve what they saw as their way of life, thus they did not make the decision to secede lightly. Number 5. Formation of the Confederacy. An important turning point in American history was the Confederate States of America's creation in February 1861, which officially ended the union of the seceded states. These states' delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, to design a constitution that emphasized state sovereignty over federal power and openly preserved slavery. This was done as a sign of the states' determination to uphold their social order and their economic interests in using slave labor. After serving as the Secretary of War and a U.S. Senator, Jefferson Davis was chosen to lead the Confederacy and provide credibility to the new administration. Although the Confederate Constitution contained several sections that solidified slavery as an institution essential to Southern society, it otherwise shared many characteristics with the U.S. Constitution. The geopolitical environment was further complicated by this new government's pursuit of international recognition and assistance, especially from European nations whose textile industries depended on cotton from the South. Both Northern and Southern Americans were informed by the establishment of this government that compromise was no longer a possibility, and that each side was now committed to its own vision for the future of America, one based on slavery and states' rights, as the other advocating for union and possibly freedom. Number 4. Growing sectionalism. Growing sectionalism, a preference for regional allegiance over national unity, was a defining feature of the decades preceding the American Civil War. This tendency was evident in the political, economic, and cultural domains. During this time, the North saw a rapid industrialization that resulted in tremendous economic expansion powered by the building of railroads and telegraphs as well as manufacturing. Abolitionist ideas were able to thrive among a variety of social groupings, including religious organizations and reform movements, as a result of the industrial boom's concentration on wage labor as opposed to slave labor. The economy of the South, on the other hand, was based on plantation agriculture, which relied on slave labor to produce cotton, a necessary good for both domestic and global trade markets. Cultural differences also played a significant influence. Abolitionist groups that emerged, driven by religious convictions and Enlightenment concepts of human rights, caused Northern society to consider slavery as morally repugnant. Many Southerners, on the other hand, fiercely supported slavery as an institution that was essential to both social order and economic prosperity, seeing it as an essential part of their legacy and identity. Due to their differences, both sides saw the other with distrust and animosity, which made compromise more difficult to achieve and ultimately resulted in an irreconcilable split that would spark a civil war. Number 3. Fort Sumter Incident. The incident at Fort Sumter served as the flashpoint for armed conflict between North and South, marking a critical turning point in American history that would lead directly into war. After months of escalating tensions following secession, Confederate forces demanded that Union troops stationed at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor surrender or face attack. Major Robert Anderson's refusal led Confederate artillery units to open fire on April 12, 1861, a calculated move intended to assert Confederate authority over federal installations within its claimed territory. The bombardment lasted approximately 34 hours before Anderson surrendered on April 13. This event marked not only the first military engagement of the Civil War, but also galvanized public sentiment across both regions. Northerners rallied around the flag in defense of what they saw as an attack on national sovereignty, while Southerners celebrated their military success as validation of their cause for independence. The attack on Fort Sumter transformed what had been primarily a political crisis into an outright war. It unified many Northerners who had previously been indifferent towards military action into staunch supporters of preserving the Union at all costs, while simultaneously solidifying Southern resolve against perceived Northern aggression. Number 2. Lincoln's response. President Lincoln acted decisively and quickly in reaction to the attack on Fort Sumter. Viewing it as an act of aggression against their newly created Confederacy, many Southerners were surprised by Lincoln's appeal for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called an uprising against federal authority. In order to unite Northern sentiment behind his leadership, Lincoln framed his proclamation as a patriotic obligation for citizens to preserve democracy against revolt, emphasizing the preservation of the Union over directly addressing slavery. This demand for troops strengthened Southern resolve to oppose what they saw as Northern tyranny intended to destroy their way of life, while simultaneously igniting ardent support in the North for military action against secessionists. Lincoln's actions signaled a shift in the course of events where both sides turned away from seeking peace and instead prepared for war. His leadership during this turbulent period would influence not only military tactics, but also public opinion about the necessity and legitimacy of fighting for one's beliefs about governance. Number 1. Further secessions. By June 1861, 4 more Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, had joined the Confederacy in response to Lincoln's call for troops following the fall of Fort Sumter. Due to its size and advantageous location, Virginia was a major player in the war, hosting major engagements like Gettysburg and Bull Run that shaped the military tactics of both sides. As a result, the state's choice was especially important. The decision of these states to secede demonstrated how deeply ingrained divisions had become. American culture. Residents rallied around their various causes. Northern resolve against Southern pride and loyalties radically shifted towards regional identities over national unity. With each new secession, both sides solidified their positions on state sovereignty versus federal authority. This demonstrated that neither side was prepared to compromise on their views on societal structure or governance, which would ultimately result in 4 years of bloody conflict marked by never-before-seen levels of violence and loss. Each of these examples demonstrates how intricate political processes, competing economic interests, disparities in culture, and singular incidents all played a part in the Civil War, one of the most defining battles in American history. If you liked our video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel.